25 million people have now tested positive for COVID-19 around the world, but health officials are also battling against online conspiracy theories, rumours and untested claims. So, how do we fight a pandemic of misinformation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story in collaboration with the Doha Forum and UNESCO. I'm Folly by Thibault. The coronavirus pandemic has forced all of us to take a step back from our daily routines. We now spend more time at home, working remotely and relying on the internet for the latest updates on the virus. But there's also been an unprecedented rise in misinformation online and on social media platforms. Everything from miracle cures, the origins of the virus, and even the existence of the virus have been questioned. Conspiracy theories have even led to injuries and deaths as people believe false and dangerous rumours posing as medical advice. And discrimination, stigmatization, racism and hate speech have also increased because of these campaigns. So, how do we fight this? And is some of the misinformation being put out deliberately? We'll ask our guests in just a moment. But before we introduce our panel, let's hear from the head of the World Health Organization, whose agency has created an entire department dedicated to fighting against misinformation. This is what Dr. Tedros Adhanom said about the issue earlier this year.
We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than this virus and is just as dangerous. That's why we're also working with search and media companies like Facebook, Google, Pinterest, Tencent, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and others to counter the spread of rumors and misinformation. We call on all governments, companies, and news organizations to work with us to sound the appropriate level of alarm without fanning the flames of hysteria.
And the head of the UN, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, has spoken of the need to urgently promote scientific and accurate information.
Around the world, people are scared. They want to know what to do and where to turn for advice. This is a time for science and solidarity. Yet the global misinfodemic is spreading. Harmful health advice and snake oil solutions are proliferating. Falsehoods are filling the airwaves. Wild conspiracy theories are infecting the internet. Hatred is going viral, stigmatizing and vilifying people and groups. The world must unite against this disease too. And the vaccine is trust. First, trust in science.
Well, let's take a closer look at the types of false information out there. There is, of course, disinformation, which is often spread intentionally for a variety of reasons, while misinformation is generally shared innocently despite being incorrect. A new study by the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene says false information led to the deaths of 800 people globally and the admission of nearly 6,000 patients to hospitals in the first 3 months of this year. Many of those incidents involved so-called miracle cures, such as drinking methanol or alcohol-based cleaning products. As a result of false information, there have also been numerous reports of anti-Asian racism on the streets of Australia, India and the United Kingdom. And a US-based advocacy group has recorded more than 1,100 cases of harassment and attacks there. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Paris, we have Guy Berger, who's Director of Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO. And here in Doha, Dr. Hanan Abdul Rahim, Dean of the College of Health Sciences at Qatar University. A warm welcome to you both. Welcome to Inside Story. So, Mr. Guy Berger in Paris, let me start with you. Bad information, whether it's produced intentionally or otherwise, has always existed. What is unique about the way misinformation works now during this COVID crisis, and what have been some of its impacts?
Right. Well, I work for UNESCO, and UNESCO is part of the UN, which is very much involved in promoting independent journalism and freedom of expression. So we approach this question from that point of view. And for us, the problem is not freedom of expression. The problem for freedom of expression is disinformation. Because disinformation today as false and misleading content with the potential to be harmful, this content, it's first amplified by internet companies that make money from this kind of content. And second of all, disinformation can only exist if it attacks freedom of expression, because freedom of expression and journalism is what exposes disinformation and the agendas behind disinformation. And so the issue is not that freedom of expression causes disinformation or freedom of expression is the problem. Actually, freedom of expression for UNESCO is part of the solution to disinformation.
Right. Before we talk about the solutions, let's talk about the causes. Explain to us why some of this bad information, disinformation in this case, is being put out deliberately, by whom, and to what end, Guy Berger?
Well, you mentioned earlier disinformation, misinformation, and of course, a lot of misinformation begins as disinformation. So, for example, somebody trying to have a financial scam to trick people, to con them out of their money, may produce disinformation to say, "Buy my miracle cure, it will save you from COVID." That is their motivation. That message can then be circulated by people who think it's true and just want to circulate for helpful reasons. So you've got an interesting interplay between the disinformation that starts with bad intent and then is distributed with innocent intent.
Right.
And so the people who distribute this information are not always the same as those who create it. And those who create it can have financial reasons, political reasons, geopolitical reasons, ideological reasons. They may also be very well organized, and they may very well be paid to do this, so that they have clients who are prepared to put a lot of money for particular reasons into creating the confusion and the polarization that goes hand in hand with disinformation.
Right. Dr. Hanan Abdul Rahim, let me bring you into the conversation. Now, you're a public health expert. Do you think the infodemic has made the pandemic worse? What are some of the health outcomes you've observed resulting from disinformation when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic?
Right. So, in your report, you talked about a number of components of misinformation or disinformation. So things like stigma or conspiracy theories or, false information. And stigma is actually very concerning because it has a number of effects on a number of levels, right? So it has an effect on people who might have the virus or have the disease. And it, of course, other than being a very negative influence on their mental health, it also has a very counterproductive effect in terms of what we're trying to do in a public health response, and that is it drives people away from the health system, from seeking care, from getting treatment, from getting good advice, rather than directing people towards it, because of course people are very concerned about being mistreated or labeled or stigmatized. At the same time, the people who find themselves in the other group, so the people who are not labeled or stigmatized, might have a false sense of security. And we saw that, for example, in other diseases. So we saw that with HIV/AIDS, where the idea was if you're not gay, then you don't have to worry about HIV/AIDS, and we know that that's not true. So it's also harmful for people to not take precautions or not to take proper actions because they don't think that they are part of the group that is at risk. So stigma can be very, very damaging.
Stigma is an issue. Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you have another specific example about what makes misinformation about coronavirus so potent? And do you think it's gotten worse as the crisis has evolved, or is it getting slightly better now?
Well, I think the thing is that there is so much that is yet unknown. And so as long as there is sometimes a vacuum of information or information that is still evolving, that's going to give room for misinformation and for disinformation. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that I think what we have to become more comfortable with is communicating uncertainty and saying that we're uncertain. And I know that's very, very uncomfortable because people really like to wait. And by people, I mean, official organizations and so on. They like to wait until they, know all the facts and until they're very sure. Well, what that does is a couple of things. One, it creates a vacuum, which can quickly be filled with misinformation and disinformation. And the other is that, the science is emerging and we're finding out new things. So it is okay to bring the public along in this journey and to say, this is the best information that we have now, but we know that it can change. Because what happens is when, guidelines suddenly change, so for example, about face masks or something, and the public hasn't really been taken along on this journey, to them, it just seems like an about turn that is very, very sudden, and that casts, a shadow on the credibility of organizations. And so it's not likely to get better, in my opinion, as long as there's so much that we still need to know and to communicate.
You talked about credibility and trust, Dr. Abdul Rahim. In the US, we've seen President Donald Trump leading the coronavirus briefings, often even contradicting his own health experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci. Whose responsibility should it be, in your opinion, to ensure that the public gets the right information about this pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's not one person's responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility. And part of the problem of misinformation and disinformation is that it erodes credibility of institutions that we have long relied on and trusted, and it undermines trust in them. Right. So that's really problematic. But I think the interesting thing about trust is in institutions, it's the kind of credit in the bank that you want to have before you have a crisis like this, where you need to to get the public's cooperation and to get the public's trust and compliance and so on. So you don't start making money when you need money, right? You start making money and saving it in the bank for when you need it. So that's why we saw, across the world, whether it's in the US or other places, when there is a problem with trust in the government, it only gets worse in a time of epidemic, and you needed to have established that credibility beforehand. So what comes to mind, for example, is an international survey that was done on the coronavirus. It was done by a number of universities, Harvard and Cambridge and so on. And, all the data are available online, and it talks about trust in government and trust in the government's response. And in some places, the distrust is as high as 80%. Right. And when you look at those countries, that's just not something that happened overnight with the epidemic, but it certainly probably was exacerbated by that.
Right. And I guess also the fact that you have sometimes perhaps leaders and politicians casting doubt on the information provided by scientists doesn't help, I guess, the scientists establish and gain trust from the public. I'll come back to that in just a moment. Let me just bring back Guy Berger into the conversation. Guy, you talked about the bad actors, and there are plenty of them, of course, who want to exploit this crisis for economic and even political gain. But what are the main causes of misinformation that we should be most worried about? Is it, the type coming from political operatives, or perhaps social media algorithms, unregulated media? Which of those is the most harmful, in your opinion?
Well, it's a combination of the above, but certainly the key moment in the whole process is not the fact that there are agents, bad actors. It's not the fact that they are naive people. The main and the new thing is that the transmission between these is under the control of big internet companies that many people say are not doing enough to really stop promoting this kind of information. In many cases, it's not even a situation that they allow it to exist on platforms, but actually they are amplifying it and recommending it because their algorithms realize that this is the kind of content that attracts interest. And the companies, like any company, they want to make money, and whatever is going to attract people, they don't mind. They will just use that content, allow that content to go there because it generates more eyeballs watching, and they can sell that attention to advertisers.
Right.
So
but
this is
some
really
of these social
the
media
new link in the
companies,
chain.
yeah, some of these social media companies have been making changes, though, as we've seen with Facebook and Twitter labeling misleading tweets. Online platforms certainly are the main tools for disinformation and consumer hoaxes, but can they alone be blamed?
Well, they're blameless because, as I said, their algorithms are really the engine by which this information is being amplified and is being exploited. So there are two dimensions. One is they have the algorithms that do this, and two, people know how to use those algorithms. So they have some blame, and they are improving. That's a good point. However, their transparency still leaves a lot to be desired. So, for example, they sometimes will tell you how much information they labeled, how much disinformation they've labeled, even stuff they've taken off their sites. But they release this information when they want to. They don't provide an ongoing access so people can see one, how widely did this disinformation travel before it was actually labeled or taken down, or will they actually take the step forward and alert those people who have seen it that indeed it was inaccurate information. So there's a huge amount more that companies can do, even if they are not the originators, not the upstream people. They are the stream by which the stuff is being spread.
Dr. Hanan Abdul Rahim, I mean, as Guy mentioned, despite social media companies removing or labeling information about, misleading information about vaccines, for example, you know, a lot of people still believe that, you know, Bill Gates, for instance, wants to use a coronavirus vaccine to implant microchips in people. Do you see the achievement of an effective vaccine being undermined by this type of information? And what more do you think social media companies should be doing?
The misinformation and the disinformation surrounding vaccines can be very, very harmful because right now you have a number of companies that are racing to come up with a vaccine, but there's always another component to that, which is people's willingness to take the vaccine. And that has to be somewhat affected by what they're seeing on social media and also offline. And I think we have to you know, to make sure that we make the point that misinformation and disinformation, I mean, yes, is being transported a lot faster with social media, but it can also happen offline as well. It happens in a lot of spaces, and that is likely to, unfortunately, if it's not countered, to influence people's readiness to take up vaccines.
Guy Berger, your thoughts about what could be the most effective ways in fighting misinformation and disinformation. You know, even for us as journalists, reporting on this pandemic has been extremely challenging because the misinformation, as we've seen, is not just coming from citizens, but also in some cases from governments and even journalists. And there's a war of narratives being waged by great powers. How do we counter this? What sort of approach is needed, Guy?
Well, I certainly agree that credibility is the key here. And if you're going to counter this, you need to have credible information. As I said, you're up against an adversary here because it's not just filling a gap where people are ignorant. There's already weeds that have been planted in people's minds. So you have to clear those weeds before you can really successfully plant the crops of knowledge. Now, I think besides for scientists, the media and governments have a key role to play here. Particularly, let me start with the governments, because first of all, governments need to allow media to be free and independent so that they can actually build their credibility and tell the story. And too many governments are still jumping on media, especially when the public needs credible media at this time. And when you have a controlled media system, well, people don't believe it. At the same time, governments need to do is open up their own information holdings a lot more. Governments need to be far more transparent with their statistics about infections, for example, about deaths, about tests, and more transparent about the contracts that they are giving to counter COVID under these emergency conditions.
Dr. Abdul Rahim, I do want to get your thoughts on the issue of free speech. How can we stop harmful information without harming free speech?
I don't think that free speech is freedom to put out misinformation. So again, I think by teaching people to educating people to be aware consumers and to be able to assess claims, then if someone uses their freedom of speech or misuses their freedom of speech to put forward information that can be harmful, I think they should be called out on it, and I think that they should be held accountable for it as well. I think that's really important because it does end up causing a lot of harm. I just want to add something on the issue of media. I certainly agree with what Dr. Berger just said. And I want to say that in our part of the world, I think one area that bears a lot of strengthening and that we've seen its effect in other places and not necessarily here is science journalism. I mean, there have been some, just like there have been some, really low quality articles written and misinformation that is spread or sensationalization. There's also been some very, very good science journalism that we've seen in the pandemic. And yes, they are usually in some of the big papers, but some really good investigative science journalism. And that's an area that I would really like to see develop in our part of the world, because that's really a gap. This is where you can take the information from researchers and not just simplify it to the public. That's not really the purpose. You want to express it in its nuances, but in a way that is more public friendly, without necessarily, without losing the nuance of it. And I think there are people who are well trained to do that and who have been able to really communicate some pretty complicated issues about immunity and about how vaccines work. And some of them have done a really good job with that. And I think the more, because like Dr. Berger said, media is much more out there. There are much more people out there, many more people consuming media than they are scientific literature. So if you can make that connection, I think that would be very helpful in countering misinformation and disinformation.
All right, Guy Berger in Paris, I'll give you the last word, and hopefully we'll leave this on a hopeful note. Are you hopeful that the fight against misinformation, disinformation, fake news can be won?
Well, it's at this stage, it's a tough call because there's a huge amount of damage. There are casualties, there are real casualties. There are casualties also to the social fabric, to the credibility of science, not just on health, but on a range of issues, climate being one of them. So it's tough, but I am optimistic that truth will in the end prevail, because if humanity is not guided by truth, then humanity will not have any progress. And even those who want to see disinformation out there, who have an interest in telling lies or spreading information that they're not even sure is true, I think that even they will come to realize at the end of the day, we've got to have some reliable information in order to navigate our way through humanity's collective challenges. And indeed, the COVID crisis is exactly one of those challenges that faces everybody everywhere.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Guy Berger in Paris and Dr. Hanan Abdul Rahim here in Doha. And thank you for watching. Thank you to the Doha Forum and UNESCO again for collaborating with us on this special edition of Inside Story. You can watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.